President, everyone here, everybody in that audience, everybody watching on C-SPAN has a loved one or knows of someone whom they've loved who is either overdosed or died actually from that overdose from fentanyl. An incredible scourge of our society right now. It is the leading cause of death among young adults 18 to 45, and synthetic opioids like fentanyl are 75% of the causes, if you will, of U.S. overdose deaths. Fentanyl continues to kill almost 200 Americans a day. 200 Americans a day. Like today, 200 Americans will die from a fentanyl overdose. An entire generation dying. Illegal fentanyl-related substances are flooding into our market from the southern border in unprecedented amounts, with the bulk of it originating in a handful of manufacturers in Wuhan province, China. By the way, you can't help but point out that this is worsened by the Biden administration's complete failure to secure the southern border. Now, currently, fentanyl-related substances are classified as Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act. This classification provides law enforcement with the tools necessary to combat this emergency, going after the criminals who, again, are flooding our communities with these deadly drugs. But Schedule 1 classification expires at the end of the year, and that's less than 8 months away. Now, for years, Congress has not made this classification permanent, and every day we get closer to this deadline, we risk losing this essential law enforcement tool. If we don't act, the chemical manufacturers in China, the cartels, the criminals who exploit our communities are emboldened, and we must not allow this to happen. That is why today I'm calling on the Senate to pass the HALT Lethal Trafficking Fentanyl Act, or the HALT Act, to permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Now, the bill is not controversial. There are no poison pills. All it does is codify current law, ensuring we don't lose tools we need to confront the fentanyl epidemic. The House, with as many problems as the House has had passing legislation, passed this bill on a strong bipartisan basis last year. And the legislation removes barriers that impede the ability of researchers to conduct studies on these substances and allows for exemptions if the research provides evidence that specific analogs of fentanyl have a valid medical purpose. So, we give law enforcement tools, but we also give the scientists, the medical scientists, tools to establish whether one of these analogs is worth having for medical purposes. Now, it's important to know, Mr. President, this week is National Police Week. We honor police officers and their service to our communities. Now, these officers are on the front lines of fentanyl crisis, holding criminals accountable, saving lives from preventing the spread of drugs, but at times giving drugs like Narcan to reverse an overdose. I'm proud to say that we have a letter from 11 national law enforcement organizations supporting the HALT Fentanyl Act. And by passing this legislation, we will send a strong message to law enforcement. We have your back. We have your back as you battle this scourge of deadly drugs in our communities. Mr. President, the clock is ticking. Failure to act puts Americans in harm's way. We must pass this bill and get it to the President's desk for signature. Thank you, Mr. President. And now, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 467 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
The Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President, very much. Reserving the right to object. The HALT Fentanyl Act would permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule 1 substances under the Controlled Substances Act. The fentanyl epidemic is ravaging communities across the United States. We are losing more than 80,000 Americans to overdose every year from opioid overdose. With deaths reaching this level, we do need every tool at our disposal to combat illicit fentanyl. But reclassification of fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I substances would limit the government's ability to research overdose and addiction treatment medications, override critical public health considerations in scheduling decisions, and extend the policy approach of the failed war on drugs. Schedule I drugs are difficult for scientists to research. Fentanyl's potency and danger demand that we study it and its analogs to combat overdose and addiction. A permanent blanket Schedule I category for any fentanyl-related substance would create barriers to vital research. This punishment-only characterization for fentanyl-related substances would eclipse the long-standing public health approach to Controlled Substances Act scheduling. The Controlled Substances Act authorizes the administration to consider concrete scientific factors when determining which scheduling category should apply to a drug. And that approach is absent here. And finally, this bill would bring the United States back to the approach of the failed war on drugs, where we criminalized drug use while ignoring the underlying issues that animate abuse and addiction. Prosecutions under this expansion will continue to disproportionately target people of color. A punishment-only approach will not reduce drugs in our communities. I have spoken to people on the front lines of this epidemic, people with substance use disorder, families who have lost a loved one, and healthcare providers. They are the ones on the front lines when people die from fentanyl. They are the ones who lose their lives or lose their patients, friends, or family when we don't invest in the security and public health tools for communities. They are the ones who are frustrated every day by archaic laws that keep people from the prevention and treatment which they need. We must do better. We must make sure people have access to tools to keep fentanyl out of their communities. We need to make sure people have access to treatment like methadone medication to keep people in recovery, and we need to save lives. But permanently characterizing fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I substances would impede our response to the overdose epidemic and lead to over-incarceration. There has to be additional discussion and debate. So let us do that so that we can give this issue the attention which it needs and that it deserves, so that any solution is effective and bipartisan. And I, as a result, at this point, have to object, Mr. President.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, may I make a response?
Senator from Louisiana.
Recognizing that there's been an objection, I would like to point out a couple things, though. As regards as if permanently scheduling fentanyl-related substances would do nothing to limit overdoses, Congress has extended fentanyl scheduling on a temporary basis multiple times, and this has led to fewer overdoses and led to creation of fewer new fentanyl-related substances. Next, the idea that fentanyl, designating them all as Schedule I, would limit the ability of researchers to study fentanyl is just not true. There's no indication that the temporary scheduling of fentanyl analogs has stifled research. DEA, the Department of the Drug Enforcement Agency, has approved every research study since 2018, but this bill goes further by putting a robust process in place to study fentanyl. It does not disrupt ongoing things, but it actually creates an expedited process for certain FDA studies to be done in partnership with federal agencies. And then lastly, that somehow this would contribute to over-incarceration. The bill does not permanently bar DEA or HHS from continuing to look at the risk associated with it. If something has no risk, they can establish it has no risk. Therefore, it would not lead to the over-incarceration. But we do know that fentanyl is a dangerous substance. And if we're concerned about over-incarceration of a certain population in our society, I can guarantee you that that population, like every population, is having people dying today from fentanyl overdose. That whichever group of Americans we're speaking of, they're losing someone today from fentanyl. And that this bill would help save a life in that particular group. And most importantly, in all groups. With that, though, recognizing there's an objection, I yield.